Welcome to part 7, in our tutorial series on how to develop a Contras-like game, with free visual game engine Gdevelop. In this video, we are going to implement the spawning of enemies to continue creating the building blocks toward our version of Contra. Since we have divided the logic and the visuals of our enemies, the implementation of the spawning is not as straightforward as in other cases that you could have seen in other tutorials, but this is a very good opportunity to learn. Let's check what we have done in the previous videos. We can move, jump, and shoot. The enemies are moving between points and when detecting us, are firing at us. If they hit us a couple of times, we are dead, and if we hit them once they are destroyed immediately. Not bad, but still a long way to go. First, as in the previous videos, let's fix some bugs. The first one is associated with the fact that when the bullet collides with the enemy and destroys it, the bullet itself is not destroyed and continues its path, which could make it kill more than one enemy per shot. To fix the bug, let's go to the group where we deal with the enemy damage and add a new action that is associated with the bullet player that deletes the object. At this stage, if you want, you can also delete the bullet trails. We will do it later on when finalizing some of the new events. Let's do the same thing for the bullet enemy after having impacted on the player. Run the game and fire a couple of shots, and you can see that the bullet is destroyed after impacting the enemy. Let's go now to the spawning. To manage correctly the spawning of enemies, we need to start making some changes in the code and start to modularize it, or we will face problems later on when implementing more functionalities and more enemies. For that, we need to move everything related to enemies to a new event sheet, that can be later on linked to any scene to manage the behaviors associated with them. If we don't do this at this stage, we will have problems later on, as everything will become more complex to manage due to replicating a lot of code in different event sheets to cope with the different enemies. To avoid it and have everything correctly organized, let's create an external event sheet for our game. Click on the Project Manager button, on the top left corner, and then click on the External Events option. It will open a new menu, where you will be able to create a new event sheet by clicking on the plus sign. Rename it to Enemies, or what other names you prefer. Press Enter or click anywhere on the screen, and Gdevelop will ask you what the default scene for the new event sheet will be. This only a formal question, as you will be able to include the new event sheet in any scene of your game. Click on the button Choose Scene, and then, in the new window, select the scene that we want to use. In our case, New Scene. Press the button Choose to finish the process. We have not a new event sheet called Enemies with no events. So now, we need to move all the events associated with the enemy behaviors into this new sheet. So copy the groups and isolated events where we were making references and performing actions on enemies to the new Enemies event sheet. Once finished, and if we want the game to keep working as it was, we need to link the enemies event back into the game events. For that, create a new group by clicking on the plus button on the top left bar and then choosing the option New Group. Click on it and rename it to Enemy. Click again on the plus button on the top left bar, and then select the option Link. This will create a new event that will ask you to click to choose the event that you want to link in. Click on the event, and then select the enemies event sheet. You now have the enemies event sheet linked to the current game event sheet. Let's keep modularizing. The next step is, instead of referring to specific enemies, let's create an abstraction that will be used to refer to any enemy that we could define in the future, independently of how it would be named and the different values of parameters that it could have. For that, in the top left bar, click on the button Groups. This will open a new panel in your Gdevelop user interface called Groups. Currently, we don't have any group, so let's create our first one. Click on the plus sign. Gdevelop will create a new group with a general name. Right-click on it, or click on the three dots to the right, and then from the menu click Rename. Rename the new group to Enemy. If you double-click on the new group, a new window will pop up, asking you to select the objects that you want to have as part of the group. Remember that later on, all the accesses to the group will be done virtually, so only includes objects that have the same structure and variables. In our case, we are going to use physic_enemy. With the group created, comes the most boring task of this video. You have to replace all the references to physic_enemy with a reference to the new group created, enemy. Since it is very straightforward, we are going to speed up the video, and we will see you on the other side. Okay. It was hard work. Let's now create the actual spawning. For that, we need to have an object on the scene that will manage the spawning of the enemies. Create a new sprite object, and add a purple color to it in Piscal. Name it Spawn Enemy, or as always any other names that could be representative for you. Edit the points, and make sure you put the origin in the center bottom of the sprite. Once finished, drag it to the scene and place it in the game view. If, like in our case, it disappears below the other visual elements, remember to open the Instance Manager, and then select the object and modify the layer to game. Drag the Spawn Enemy object to the part of the level where you can see it when running the game. Now, Select the physic enemy object. To make it work, we need to add some object variables. Some will be used in this video, others are being included to be used in the next videos. So, from the left pane, click on the button Add Near Instance Variables, then click on the button with an arrow point up, that will take you to the instance variables, and then click on the button Edit Object Variables. Add the following variables: enemy type, which will allow us to define more enemies. ID that will help us create a parent-child relationship with the objects that will create the overall enemy. Click Apply to close. Click on the enemy sprite, and open up the same menu as in the previous case, by clicking on the Instances Variables menu. Add a new variable called Parent ID, that will link the sprite with the correct physic manager when spawned. Go to the Enemies tab. From the left top bar, click on the Add button, and then on the Group option. Name the new group Spawn Enemies. Add a new SubEvent by clicking on the Add SubEvent button. Add a new condition associated with Spawn Enemy. In the search box, type Distance. Select the option Distance between two objects. In the Object field, choose the Physic Player, and in the Distance field, type a range that you may think can be interesting to detect the player and start spawning enemies. In our case, we have selected 350 pixels, but we will, later on, increase it to 1000 pixels. Click OK to close. What we have done, is defining a distance between the player and the spawn point, as to have only the spawning of enemies when the player is relatively near the spawn point. This will avoid us to have a lot of objects being created when no need, and even may be destroyed if moved out of the screen too fast. But we also need to make sure that there will be a reduced number of enemies, so for this, we are going to use a timer that will control how often enemies will be spawned. So, add a new condition to the event that we have just created associated with the object Spawn Enemy and check against the value of a new timer spawn time that we are going to set for now to 5. Click on the Add action, and then select the enemy group that we have created in one of the previous steps. Type in the search box, Create, and from the list, Create Object. For the X, set it as Spawn Enemy, X, and for the Y as Spawn Enemy, Y. Don't forget to set the layer as Game. This will create the logic of the enemy, but we also need its visuals. Click again on Add Action and select from the list Enemy Sprite, and then Create Object at the same coordinates as the previous game object. At the moment, we just have created two isolated objects that don't have any relationship with each other, but if we wanted to act as an enemy, we need to create a relationship. Let's use a variable that will be used to link the enemy logic and the enemy sprite, using the object variables ID and parent ID. The idea is that the object with ID field will act as the parent, that will control all the aspects of the sprite object, that will be acting as a child object of the first one. So, when creating them, we need to associate one to the other with a number. That number can be very easily created by keeping the count of the enemies spawned from the spawn enemy and then assign it to the instanced objects. For that, let's go to the scene view and select the spawn enemy object and then click on the instance variable link, and then in the Edit Object Variables. Finally, click the Add button to create a new object variable named SpawnCount that we will initialize with 0. Now, go back to the event, and in the action associated with the enemy spawn that we were creating, add actions to modify the object variables ID of the group enemy and the parent ID of enemy sprite to spawn enemy variable SpawnCount. This will create the possibility to link the enemy sprite with the physic enemy that is the structure of the enemy group. Now, that we have created the enemy, we need to initialize it correctly as we were doing before at the beginning of the scene, but which will have to be done at each enemy spawn. So, go to at the beginning of the scene and copy all the actions associated with the enemy and paste them into the spawn enemy actions. Although we were not able to see it directly, the player sprite is bigger than the enemy sprite, and the physic player's box, so this would generate two problems. The first one, a small enemy inconsistent with the other sprites. In the second case, the bullets would never collide with the box collider as it is smaller than the height at which the bullets are fired. So, add two new actions. In the first one, select the enemy sprite, and then choose the propriety scale. In the modification sign set to and in the value the number 2. In the second action, choose the enemy group, and then the height propriety and increase it to 100 pixels. We are almost there, but not yet, because although we have created both objects, they would not be associated one to the other. For that, add a sub-event to the spawn creation, and then as the condition, let's check if the ID variable of the enemy is equal to the parent ID of the enemy sprite. For the action, select the function link and enemy sprite. This will make it possible to update parameters from one object and the directly linked object. This means that although they are linked, the changes on one object are not propagated to the link object. You need to manually update the changes to the other object using the link created between them. Let's create a new group by click on Add button on the top left bar, and then clicking on Group. Name it Group Objects. Click on the Add button on the top left bar and click on the For Each option. This will create a new event that will cycle through all the instances of an object. Just select the object that you want to associate with the loop, which in our case will be enemy. Then click the Add Condition link and in the search box type link. Gdevelop will display an option named Take into account linked objects. Click on it. In the left pane enter the enemy and the enemy sprite. Then add an action for the enemy sprite and set the position to another object, where you will be passing the coordinates enemy x and enemy y. This will make the enemy sprite to copy the position of the enemy object. Go to the scene view, and delete the physic enemy and enemy sprite on the scene. We will not need them anymore, as we are about to start spawning all the enemies that we want. While deleting the objects, we just saw that we were not hiding the new spawn enemy. So go to the enemies event sheet, and at the top of the event sheet copy the hide enemy action and paste it. Change the reference to spawn enemy. Time to check what is the status. Run the game. Nothing seems to be happening. Let's move forward, maybe the range is too small. Okay, there is an enemy that just spawned but it seems not moving, although it is flipping. Although looking in more detail, it seems that we have many more enemies in the same position. Go back to the enemies event sheet, and in the condition for the enemy spawning, add a trigger once condition. This will make sure that there is only one enemy spawned. Let's move also the spawn enemy box to be closer to the player as to be able to check more quickly if it is working or not. Run the game again. There is one enemy, but he is not moving. It is like glued to the ground, although he is detecting the player and firing at him. Go back to the enemies event. One of the problems is associated with the fact that we didn't remove the previous action that updated the enemy sprite position to one of the enemy. Delete this action. Another problem is that, during the conversion, we missed a couple of physic enemy references. Replace them with the enemy group reference. Let's run again. No. Still not working. The enemies are being spawned correctly, but they are not moving. Let's go back again to the events. Okay, we may have another error when we link the objects, as we are making the references from the enemy sprite for enemy when it should be the opposite. Let's replace the references to the objects. We have another typo in the enemy group. At the beginning of the group we are setting the variable player in range of enemy to 0, and when updating the references, Gdevelop used bullet enemy instead of enemy. Correct it back to enemy. Let's run it to check the status. Okay, the enemies seem to be spawned correctly and move correctly as expected. They detect the player and fire at it. Let's try to do some kill. We have a problem. We are killing all enemies with one single shot. Also, the score is only increased by 1000 points. But looking more closely, the enemies are only being generated when we get in and out of the range of the spawner. Again, there are a couple of problems. The first problem is caused by the fact that we are not resetting the time once it has been used to generate the new spawn. So, we need to make sure to reset it to 0 after the enemy is created. Add a new action, select spawn enemy, and then type reset and choose from the list start or reset a time. In the text box type in spawn time. The second problem is caused by not increasing the number of enemies spawned by the object spawn enemy, and which means that all objects are having a parented and ID sets to 0. This is originating a wrong linking between the created objects, and have them not to act as expected. To fix it, in the spawn enemies, add a new action, and then select spawn enemy object and the modify value of variable that will be adding 1 to spawn count. Another problem that we have, is on the damage event. When we are resetting the spawn time timer, we can see that in the condition we have used it without quotes, while in the action we have it with it. Edit the event action and remove the quotes from the spawn time. Click OK to apply. If we test the game, we can see that now most of the things are working. But when we fire, we are killing all enemies in just one shot. In reality, we are not killing all the enemies, we are deleting all the enemy sprites, because in the damage enemy event, we are deleting the enemy sprite in general, and they get all deleted and not the specific one associated with the object hit by the bullet. To solve this, what we need to do, for each instance of the enemy group, check if there is a collision with the bullet player, and if it is the case, then execute the actions. Since we have the parent ID and ID, we will also check those two elements to be double sure that it is only deleting the sprite associated with the specific enemy hit by the bullet. For that, create a new for each event by clicking on the Add button on the top left bar and then for each. Click on the for each event and select the enemy group. Click on the condition and select the enemy group. In the search box type collision and select the option collision. In the object field, select bullet player and click OK to close. Click on Add Condition again, select the enemy group and then type variable in the search box. From the list, select value of an object variable. In the variable box type ID, for the modification sign choose equal to and in the value, type enemy sprite variable parent ID and click Apply. Add a new condition with a trigger once. Select the actions that are in the existing event for the damage and move them to the new event just created. Delete the old event. Run the game to see if it is working. No, it is still killing more than one enemy in one single fire shot. The problem seems to be similar to the one that we had with the movement. We are forcing on the link update, so in the condition, we need to check that we have the right enemy sprite by checking with the link created between parent and child. We have already implemented this for the movement, so let's go to the movement event, and copy the condition taken account link to, and paste it in our damage event. Let's run it again. And it is running. We can now shoot and only one enemy is dying, and each death is increasing our score. We have a slight delay to improve. The death of the enemy is somewhat dull. Let's apply the enemy death particles that we created in one of the previous episodes, and created under the damage enemy actions. For the position, you can use the enemy X and enemy Y. Let's run the game. The particle are somewhat small. Let's make some quick adjustments to the particle effects to make it more visual. We will fast forward. You can pause if you need to check in more detail the configurations. Let's try the game. Not bad, we can kill and are spawned enemies when dying or leaving a splash of blood. Let's finish the video. In the next episodes, we will keep fine-tuning that game juice by adding a hurt animation to the player, some damage particles, and probably some screen shake effect that is always cool to see. We hope that you have liked this video. If it has been the case, consider subscribing, giving a like, and clicking on the notification button. If you have any questions, problems, or comments, don't hesitate in putting a comment and we will answer as fast as we could. See you in the next video, game developers.